Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining United to Safeguard America from Illegal Trade, or USAIT's training, Protecting Michigan from Illegal Trade. My name is Edward Kritikos, a representative of USAIT's operation team. Illegal trade fuels a $2.2 trillion per year industry of global transnational crime. Dangerous criminal networks get rich from many forms of illegal trade, including engaging in trafficking, illegal drugs, counterfeit medicines and PPE, illegal guns, cybercrime, organized retail crime, and smuggling stolen, counterfeit, and pirated goods, and even human beings. However, no single company, industry, or government can solve this complex issue on its own. Combating illegal trade requires cooperation and public-private partnerships, making full use of existing expertise, information sharing, innovative solutions, and evolving technologies. Public actors, the private sector, and civil society alike all have a role to play. Launched in 2021, USAIT is a public education initiative to combat black market crime. The initiative is supported by a coalition of more than 75 national and state brand enforcement experts, law enforcement agencies, academics, leading business organizations, and spans 15 states facing critical illegal trade issues. Michigan is among these states. Through localized workshops, training, and information sessions, the USAIT Coalition aims to provide local officials, law enforcement, and other leaders with tools and skills needed to prevent the increase of illegal trade and related crimes. The initiative also raises public awareness on the scope and severity of illegal trade and the consequences it inflicts on states and municipalities. Today, we will be hearing from a number of experts on the ways illegal trade has impacted Michigan. The training will be divided into two panels. In our first panel, Enforcement Challenges Against Illegal Trade, we will hear from experts in law enforcement and national security who will examine the scale and scope of illegal trade in the state and how illegal commerce connects with other sinister crimes. They will provide real examples of recent seizures and explore how Michigan policymakers are addressing this threat. Our second panel, Industry Perspectives in the Fight Against Illegal Trade. We will hear from industry representatives with extensive experience in areas of illegal trade, intellectual property, and brand protection. Our panelists will provide insight into what the private sector faces on a daily basis with respect to illegal trade, and how their industries are fighting back against global supply chain threats through illegal-led investigations, innovative technologies, and proactive risk management approaches. A Q&A will follow each of our panel discussions. Please provide any questions you may have in the chat section. Our moderator for today's discussion is none other than Matt Albence, USAIT spokesman and former director of the Immigration Customs Enforcement. Matt, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, everybody, for joining us and taking the time out of your busy schedules. As Ed mentioned, my name is Matt Albence. I'm formerly the acting director of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. I spent most of my career as a special agent or within the ranks of the investigative arm of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, now known as Homeland Security Investigations. I'm an old guy, so back when I did it, I was actually in Detroit from 2004 to 2006. I was a deputy special agent in charge of what was ICE's Office of Investigations, which is now Homeland Security Investigations. So I'm intimately familiar with the challenges and issues that Michigan faces, and those have only grown since I've departed there, close to 2 decades ago. As Ed mentioned, we were doing a nationwide approach with regard to USAIT and finding partners in both the public and private sectors throughout the country. But we are focusing our efforts on specific states where we have known specific issues with regard to illegal trade in all of its forms, whether it's human trafficking, whether it's narcotics trafficking, whether it's counterfeit goods, whether it's illegal trafficking in cigarettes. And Michigan, obviously, and I'm probably not telling you things that you don't already know, but Michigan, we start looking at the volume of commerce that comes through there, especially when you start looking at the ports and across the river. Detroit border crossing handles more than $206 billion in cross-border commodities annually, with more than 13,000 trucks and 25,000 automobiles driving through every single day. Criminal enterprises, let's just take one industry, the automotive industry. Obviously a key sector of the Michigan economy, loses an estimated $3 billion every year due to service parts, counterfeiting of the products that auto manufacturers make. And you start looking at with tobacco, illegal tobacco trade. It costs the states and its taxpayers more than $200 million every year in illicit tobacco trade. You start looking at narcotics. There's 12 high-intensity drug trafficking areas within the state of Michigan. Seven most deaths in the country in 2018 from cocaine. And obviously what we've seen now with the fentanyl and all the challenges that that's creating and the public safety risks that poses to everyone across our society, that issue is even more prevalent as we deal with it now. And then you start looking at human trafficking. Michigan is definitely a place where there are large numbers of human trafficking. And then, one of the more recent things that's at least recent in the media perspective, but not recent for those in the law enforcement or private sector who have been dealing with this, is what we've seen in the organized retail crime front. And I think we're going to talk about that more on the second panel. But if you look at the numbers in 2021 alone, retail thefts in Michigan cost more than $1.9 billion, were worth more than $1.9 billion, costing the taxpayers in Michigan $169 million in tax revenue. And as we all know, between the inflationary times, the economic impact of COVID, and the shutdowns, the economy, money for public works, whether they're hospitals, schools, roads, is more critical now than it ever has been in the past. And when we have large sums of dollars that are not going to the public coffers and are going to criminal organizations, that only exacerbates the problems and the challenges that we're facing. So I'm going to stop talking there. I want to bring in our panelists and our experts. I want to let them each introduce themselves a little bit, give them some of their background and what they're working on. I have some questions to ask them, but please, if you have questions out there in the audience, please type them into the chat box. The more we do a good number of these, and the more informal and the more interaction between the audience and the panelists, the better these things seem to go. So again, thank you for your time. I want to thank all of our panelists up front. I know they're very busy and have a lot of other things going on. We really appreciate them taking the time out of their schedules to meet with us. So I will start with Carrie Campbell. Carrie is the director of the Michigan State University Center for Anti-Counterfeiting and Product Protection, the ACAP Center. Has been a big partner to USAIT throughout this initiative and even prior to us standing it up. So Carrie, why don't you give a little bit about yourself, please? Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Matthew. And thanks to USAIT for the invitation. As Matt mentioned, I'm the director of the ACAP Center. We are a multidisciplinary research center housed at Michigan State University. So happy to be part of a Michigan event. We often spend a lot of time working nationally or even internationally on this, so it's always great to have an event in our home state. We've been studying the issue of trademark counterfeiting and more recently too, how it fits into the larger scope of illicit trade for about 13 years. We try to do research a little bit differently than the typical academic ivory tower research where you research and publish. And we try to make sure our research is informed by practice, whether that be brand protection professionals who are dealing with this problem from the corporate perspective, or whether that is state, local, federal, or even international law enforcement who are dealing with this from the criminal side. We have been doing research on the topic, at least around the criminality of trademark counterfeiting, for our entire 13 years that we've been around, looking at patterns in crime as far as what the counterfeiters are doing and how they've evolved. And I know we'll be talking a little bit on the panel about the evolution from primarily brick and mortar counterfeiting into the online space. But we've also looked at patterns of prosecution, arrests, convictions under this as well. And then we also examine the legislation in the space too, and have been pretty active in the last few years in a lot of the pieces of either pending or recently passed legislation that looks at the online space, as we see that becoming increasingly dangerous, both for IP rights holders, but also for consumers, and how that can affect anyone in the state of Michigan as we look at that. So thank you, Matt, for that introduction.
Thanks, Carrie. That was great. And our next guest on this first panel, which again focuses on enforcement challenges against illegal trade, is Chris Sullins with Homeland Security Investigations. Chris?
Greetings, Mr. Albans. Greetings, USAIT Michigan. Thank you so much for your time. Just by a quick introduction, my name is Christopher Sullins. I am with HSI, or Homeland Security Investigations. As Mr. Albans mentioned, that is the principal arm, the investigative arm of DHS. We're responsible for investigating transnational crime and threats, but we specifically look at international trade as one of our main tenets. Trade's in our history, to be honest. It's in our lineage or our provenance, if you will, as DHS was actually born out of the merger of two federal agencies, one of which was the U.S. Customs Service, which was the oldest federal law enforcement agency at that time because it went back to 1789. HSI, we have over 10,000 employees and over 225 offices domestically and also internationally around the world. At a more micro level, I lead the Global Trade Task Force here at HSI Detroit, where we focus on trade-related investigations, and we also work other type of investigations as well. So we do complex financial investigations, including CARES Act fraud. We do forced labor investigations as it's in the supply chain and so on. And I'm happy to be here with you today. Thank you so much again for the time.
Thanks, Chris. Great to have you. So, Carrie, I will start with you. And one of the things you brought up initially, which I think really needs to have some further discussion because it is such a challenge, I know, from the enforcement perspective, but also from the private sector perspective, is the movement from the brick and mortar stores to the internet, and how has that impacted the retailer space? And what concerns or potential strategies have you shared with policymakers to address this issue? And you mentioned legislation. Are there particular things that you've seen in this legislation that you think would be more effective than others? And I know that's a multi-pronged question there, so please take your time.
I will try not to talk for 4 hours about that. So we are all aware of that shift, right? Anyone who shops is aware of the shift from regular retail to be from brick and mortar to the online space. And as most of us know, during the pandemic, that accelerated very, very quickly. And because of that, the level of deception online is much more sophisticated and a little bit easier to do than it is in the brick and mortar space. And we see that echoed in counterfeit goods. So, you read some of the earlier cases from 15, 20 years ago, and we're talking about flea markets, we're talking about bodegas, we're talking about, goods out on the street in the back of someone's trunk, and we still see that. But what we've really seen is people having to, in those cases, search out those places or go to them to buy them. When we move counterfeit goods into the online space, we see them moved very easily and very quickly. We all knew that it was coming and we watched it happen, but I think we have seen it just absolutely explode and sort of get out of control, in the sense that you can go to any online platform of any kind and find counterfeit goods, whether that's a platform that's specifically for e-commerce or whether that's a social media platform, the dark web, and many other places where that activity takes place. So when we were studying this from the brick and mortar perspective, we looked at something we call the crime triangle, which is there's a meeting in space and time where the offender will, commit the crime upon the victim. And in order to disrupt that proactively, you have to remove one of the legs of the triangle, whether that is protecting the potential victim, whether that's preventing the offender from being in that space, whether that is monitoring the space to make sure that it's safe. One of those options will take away that place for the crime to take place. So when we take that theory and we put that in the online space, it works as well. So when we've been talking to Congress the last 2 years about a lot of the potential legislation that's up federally, and also some of the state level legislation, such as the Informed Consumers Act or the Shop Safe Act, there were a lot of provisions in it that were really important. That mentioned, proactive monitoring of the site and, some education for consumers and a lot of reactive approaches. So once there's a counterfeit posting up, you should take it down. But we tend to go back to that theory of the crime triangle, and that if we really want to disrupt this, at least in that online space, we have to remove one of those points on the triangle. And the biggest challenge is when we look at that theory, there's something called controllers at each of those levels of the triangle. Someone who's in charge of protecting the victims or protecting the space or preventing the offender. In the online space, that becomes very, very limited. And we find that the control for that space is primarily the e-commerce platform and the social media platform. So the rest of us on the outside, whether that is law enforcement, academics, the brand looking for their product being counterfeited. Online investigators are looking at this from an outside perspective. We don't really have control over prevention in that space. We can reactively report and say, oh, we saw a counterfeit here. We saw this consumer bought this product and got injured from it, or whatever. But when we look at that theory, we really need the platforms to be partners in all of this, to be partners with law enforcement, to be partners with the brands, because they're the only ones that can prevent that meeting of time and space of the online counterfeiter and the consumer who's about to click and purchase a counterfeit good to happen. And we've seen that spill over into other areas as well with some of our partners who look at the online sale of illicit pharmaceuticals or the online sale of other types of illicit goods that we know are sold in various similar ways. Sometimes it's a bit different when we're talking, the difference between the sale of baby formula online as opposed to um, marijuana or whatever that may be. We see different regulations around it, of course, but we see very similar patterns in the criminality. So we've urged legislatures to really look at that and to look at something that will last more than 5 years. So that's the other thing. We talk about law disruptive technology. So as we all know, not only has the shift happened from brick and mortar to online, but technology and the use of technology, both by law enforcement and brands and governments, as well as bad actors, is increasing exponentially. So we need to be very thoughtful about the legislation we're creating to make sure we're not focusing or relying on technology that exists today in 2022 that may be totally irrelevant or obsolete 5 years from now or 10 years from now, because we don't want to be in the same situation we're in now where the existing law has some application, but when we get into the online space, it's very, very difficult to look at and to actually apply and for investigators and prosecutors and courts to be able to adjudicate because it becomes irrelevant. Thank you.
Have you found, Carrie, if I could just follow up, have you found the legislators receptive to these discussions? They seem to understand it. I mean, there's some states that have actually moved forward with some pretty effective laws, even some states where you would not necessarily expect them to be proactive in this. But I'm just curious what your experience has been there, particularly in Michigan.
Yeah, so I don't have any direct experience actually with the Michigan legislature, but at the congressional level, I found people very open to the conversation. But there are as we all know, very strong lobbies that are pushing for certain parts of the bills to be taken out or added. I think there's a lot of I think this is one of the first set of pieces of legislation in the past, these ones that have come out in the past 2 years that are really pushing the envelope of some type of internet regulation in the sense of like regulating who is selling, who is buying, how to vet them. And there's a lot of uneasiness around it. There's a lot of wariness of who's going to get this data, what is it going to look like. So I think there's receptivity, but I think as well a lot of the big teeth in some of these pieces of legislation are softened a bit. Or their enforcement mechanisms are not very hard. It's very different if you open up a company to a lawsuit for secondary trademark liability as opposed to saying they may have an unfair practice violation and more like a small slap on the wrist. I think penalties make a big difference, and unfortunately what we see with trademark counterfeiting legislation throughout the country. So all 50 states have some form of trademark counterfeiting criminal legislation in one way or another. For the most, I think it's 41 or 42 states actually have one that says trademark counterfeiting, and the other 9 have some type of legislation that can be used to prosecute. We see less than half of them actually using the legislation. So that's going to be a question. Are states going to use Inform? And we hope that they do. These pieces of legislation, we're very excited that they're going through, but if they're not used, it's a very curious phenomenon that a lot of effort has gone into some of these, and then we see them not being used when we know counterfeiting is rampant, and it's a big part of this larger piece of illicit trade.
No, you're exactly right, and that's a great segue over to Chris, because legislatures can do all they want to pass laws, but if you don't have one, law enforcement to investigate those cases, and two, attorneys, whether they're state attorneys or district attorneys or federal attorneys in the U.S. attorney's offices to prosecute those cases, then you really haven't accomplished anything. And one of the challenges, and Chris, I'd like you to speak to this a little bit, and then I have a follow-up, is, sometimes it's illicit trade is seen as a victimless crime. It's seen as either just big, large, multi-billion-dollar corporations, so they're losing a few pennies here and there. We would hear, Chris, you hear it. I heard it when I was still on the job. Every time a Super Bowl came along, we'd go out there and do seizures of all these counterfeit goods, and why are you out there being the NFL's police and things like that? And I think with the COVID pandemic and some of the things that the agency did with regard to Operation Stolen Promise and bringing to the forefront in the prominence of the challenges created by illicit trade, especially when you start talking about the fake PPE and the fake pharmaceuticals that were all supposedly going to help people avoid getting COVID-19. The public's consciousness was raised. And I think, it's important to continue to move that message along. But Chris, what have you seen with regard to these illicit trade networks and these transnational criminal organizations? It's not just somebody focusing on counterfeit Gucci purses or counterfeit NFL or NBA jerseys. What are you seeing with these transnational criminal organizations and how they're involved in illicit trade and so many other crimes that they converge with?
That's a great question, sir. So you're 100% right. This is one of those crimes where we can find something, and it typically does not just stop with the charges for the counterfeit products. As you mentioned, there'll be transnational criminal organizations that will do this kind of stuff that will also involve in other crimes like money laundering or structuring or trying to get money out of the country for illicit purposes. So this is one where we can, once we find this, we usually find something else as well. So that's why it's important. As far as being a victimist crime, you're right. There is some people that say that. I would argue against that. I think one of the best things that we can show, typically you see it on the news every Christmas, right? You'll see the counterfeit UL Christmas lights or trees, and there's been people, unfortunately, that have lost their lives with counterfeit products that way, or with subpar airbags. Let's say if I'm in my car with my family, I certainly don't want an airbag in there that's not OEM. If it needs to deploy, I need it to be a real one and not a counterfeit one that's not going to work. So there can be some serious detrimental stuff that can occur with these counterfeit products as well. This is obviously the USAIT Michigan. So let's talk about that if you don't mind, even just here. Is counterfeit or illegal trade, is that a problem here in Michigan? I'm sure many of you guys on the call and preaching to the choir, you guys know that there is. Hopefully we can get even more people to realize that there is. Many people think it might just be in other states, maybe a huge state like Texas or a state with a seaport like California or New York, but that's not the case. Mr. Albans, just as an example, you mentioned PPE. Obviously, during the pandemic, one of the most important things that people were trying to get was like the personal protective equipment, PPE. That was one of the biggest things people were trying to find, not only for their occupations, but also for their own families. We, as Global Trade Task Force, just in Detroit, so we're just in one city with HSI and one state in the country. In 2021 alone, we seized almost 1 million counterfeit N95 masks. These masks were not going just through the mail to people. Believe it or not, the statistic that I'm giving you for the almost 1 million masks seized, these were all going to the absolute front line. I can't get into too many details, but I'll say it's the front line. In March, we had over 320,000 of them seized. That was 53 pallets worth, so about 2 semi-trucks. Then in September, we seized well over 600,000 again from the front line. These were counterfeit ones coming in from China. I'm working a current seizure right now. I wish I could brief it. I'm sure you guys understand. I have to get all kinds of clearances. I got the first 2 levels and then they shot me out of the sky. So I can't talk about it in too much granular detail, but I can say that we went into an organization that we had a search warrant for counterfeit products, and it actually ended up being much greater than we had anticipated at first. At this point, we're still working the operation. Just so you guys know, we are over 75 semi-trucks full. 75 semi-trucks full of counterfeit products that we've had to palletize, load up, and send off for evidence. So it's quite a large-scale thing. I hope that later on, you guys will have me back and I can share some cool pictures and videos of that one. Some of you guys probably know, you guys have asked me about it directly. I was just told I can't talk about it in detail. So I can say this, on the USAIT.org page, on the Michigan page there is a sentence in there that talks about a certain sector, a key industry in Michigan that loses an estimated $3 billion. Mr. Albans pointed to it as well, annually due to service part counterfeiters. I can say it's in that industry, and it's a major seizure that we're still in the middle of. So in case you didn't see what I was doing there, I'm trying to drive traffic to the site, and I'm not even charging per click, which is awesome. As far as working with
Well done, Chris.
yeah, as far as working with industry and private sector, there is a difference between working at behest of a corporation and working with a corporation. I sometimes hear from people that they think the government should never work with industry. For me, though, it's been a great experience and it has helped immensely. I can give an example of this current seizure. When we walk in and we're looking at, in total, hundreds of thousands of square feet of counterfeit product, or maybe commingled, it vastly helps us if industry can come in and treat it and be like, that one's counterfeit, that one's not, that one's counterfeit, that one's not. Otherwise, as HSI agents, we would be there for the next 20 years. So that private-public partnership is something that I have found extremely helpful for me. It's been a great experience. If I can speak to you guys on the call, I really, first of all, I appreciate the time. I appreciate all you guys being on there. But I also want to just try to motivate you guys, whether you're in law enforcement or in industry, just please don't give up working towards finding and eradicating this illegal trade. Clearly, it's a problem. It's everywhere. Like we discussed, it's not just far off lands or states, but it's right here in Michigan, close to home and close to our workplaces as well. Again, I'm preaching to the choir, just don't give up. It's too important. Your efforts are appreciated and they're needed. And then if I can encourage you guys as well, like if anybody that's on this call or it gets passed to somebody else that sees it, that's newer to this space, there are resources out there to help in almost every step of this process or endeavor. I know USAIT is one. I can assure you that HSI and the Detroit Global Trade Task Force are another one that's here to help. And I know that many of you guys are willing to help each other as well. We all have something to contribute, whether we're in academia, we're in law enforcement, or we're in industry, right? But perhaps it's in helping each other and in working together and then filling the puzzle with the specific piece that I might have and joining with you guys who have a different piece that I don't have, that we can increase our efforts. Like by myself, I might be productive, but it's just going to be linear. But with you guys helping us or us helping you, I think that we can easily find the increase in efforts to be exponential. Kind of reminds me of a statistic I saw on draft horses, right? That old adage where they say one horse can pull 8,000 pounds. You would think if you put two together, it'd be 16,000, but it's actually 22,000. But if you train those two to work together and train them together, they can pull up to 32,000 pounds. That's exponential. That's what we're looking to do here with you guys and with all of our partners. And logic follows that if we increase these efforts, then we're going to increase our successes. And that's what we're all looking to do, right? So eradicating illegal trade, it doesn't have to help me individually or help you individually or help HSI or even help XYZ Corporation. In direct or indirect ways, it actually does help all of us. So thank you so much again for having me here today. I really appreciate it. And I definitely look forward to working with all of you in the future to safeguard America from illegal trade.
Hey, Chris, one thing I'd like to follow up on, you mentioned the Global Trade Task Force. Who comprises that? Is that just a federal or do you have agencies from across the spectrum on that?
Yes, it's primarily federal, but we do have state and local partners as well. So it's HSI, it's CBP. We have people from other federal agencies as well. And then we love to get even local state and local task force officers involved as well. And then just try to do as much as we can do to try to just crush it in the Detroit area and in the Detroit AOR and eradicate as much of the illegal trade as we can as a partnership.
Right. Yeah. And that's, and you know, you've got a long career as well, you know, and you see these task force environments where you actually have everybody checking their badges at the door and just there to do the mission and to get the job done. And that's one of the things we've done through USAIT is actually work with, we actually work with the Michigan Chiefs of Police Association. We work with several other states as well, trying to get them involved in this. Obviously, they've got a multitude of challenges that they're facing, not just operationally, but with regard to hiring and funding and all the like. But again, pooling those resources and utilizing all those different authorities that each of these agencies possess is really an effective tool, and it certainly does work in this environment. So Chris, thanks so much for all of that. And one of the things you mentioned, I'd like to get Carrie's perspective on that is information sharing. You know, and again, going back to the task force environment, that's where some of these informal conversations and information is shared, but you also have government agencies, whether they're state, local, or federal. There's a lot of bureaucracies that exist, and sometimes it's difficult to get that information flow to all the people that need to have it. So, Carrie, do you have any perspective from your your field of expertise with regard to how information sharing can be improved? Is there anything that you've seen that could be done to make it more effective, or just your thoughts in general, please?
Sure. So, at least from the research perspective, we when we're searching for data on counterfeiting, at least, it's very difficult to find. So some data is tracked very, very well. Federally, it's very different than it is at the state level. And we've seen many states don't even track this data. They don't track the number of arrests or convictions or even investigations under certain statutes, particularly when we're looking at counterfeiting statutes. So one, I think something that might be helpful is some type of national streamlining of data collection for at least counterfeiting, but perhaps other types of illicit trade as well, maybe under a larger umbrella that might be more successful. And the other thing I often hear too, between the private sector and law enforcement, is the private sector doesn't want to turn over sometimes data because they're afraid they're not going to hear back on all the details of the law enforcement investigation. As Chris mentioned, that's just part of how it works. You can't share everything until it's over, and even then but even the other way as well. So sometimes that just requires a lot of relationship building and a lot of understanding that we do all play very different roles, and we don't play the same roles, but there's ways to still work together towards this problem and share data on these issues. And there is a way to work side by side and not to have one group doing the work for the other group, but to have it be complementary. And I think a lot of people that I've been with in the field for some time understand that, and then I think a lot of people too, I think, still struggle with that, and still try to stay in those silos. And as we know, the silos are not effective when we're dealing with a set of bad actors who don't have silos and don't care who has the data or who is cooperating or whatever. I mean, they don't care about boundaries, they don't care about jurisdictions. So that makes it even more important on our end to be able to do that. So legislation could help. It's not everything. It certainly isn't everything. So some of it is building those relationships and learning how to take advantage of them, while recognizing the differences on the other side and the limitations that your partners may have.
No, that's great. That's really good. Thanks. Ed, I think we have some questions coming in from the field, or excuse me, from the audience.
We do. Thanks, Matt. So our first question, going back, Chris, to what you said, what can we do to ensure we aren't buying counterfeit or fake items as consumers?
Yeah, I think one of the best things, right? And as Carrie mentioned, it gets harder today because there's so many places you can buy things online. But obviously, like if you're buying direct from the manufacturer, from their approved retail channels, like that's one of the best and easiest things that I could say, just to throw it out there, just to begin with. So for example, if you're looking for a Gucci purse, right? Like that's not going to be sold at a flea market. Typically, that's not their distribution channel. So if you can go through actual approved distribution channels, that's going to give you the best chance. And then also many of the brands I found are very helpful. So if you do buy something that you think might be counterfeit or something like that, many of them will have ways to help you, or you could reach out to them, and many of them are more than amenable to trying to help you ascertain if it is or not, because then they have a vested interest too. Like if you did get one that was counterfeit, they want to know where it was from and try to figure it out as well. But as far as just if I had to narrow it down to one thing, it'd be just to get it from the best distribution channel and approved one that you can.
Carrie, anything you want to add on that?
Can I add to that? Yeah. So I agree 100% with Chris. And as someone who has worked in this field for a while, but somehow continues to purchase counterfeits online, surprisingly, even though I think I should be educated enough on this topic to not do so. Slow down is the best thing I can say. Like, we are very much in a fast-paced society, including with shopping and getting discounts. Slow down for a second. If you're buying online and it looks like it's the manufacturer, take a second to look at where they're based, look at the address, look at the reviews. It doesn't have to be a 4-hour research project, but just slow down a second to take a look at it. Because often we click on the highest, the highest listed item, which may be the cheapest, or maybe it has the best reviews. And when you start to look into it, you realize, I also always try to buy from the manufacturer, but I look at it and I realize this isn't the manufacturer, but it's deceptively listed as such. So I think that's really important for for us to just slow down for a second while we're consuming, and making sure that we have a second to actually double check that.
Awesome. And another question we have coming in, are there things that a manufacturer could do to minimize the ability to counterfeit its products?
I'm happy to take that one too. So, we've actually done research on this with the companies that we've worked with over the years, and there's a wide variety of things. There's not one specific thing, and I know that the panel following us is full of people from industry that can probably answer a lot of those questions too. But we recommend a very holistic approach by the manufacturers or the brands. Again, not one particular thing. Part of it is education and awareness within the company, as well as in some cases external to the company, doing a risk assessment to see, what that looks like, making sure, you're doing market monitoring, whether that's online, or knowing what that looks like both nationally but also internationally. We talk to a lot of small businesses in Michigan who say they only sell in the Michigan market, but they sell online. And we say the minute you sell online, you're going to be in the international market, whether you want to be or not. The minute you're exposed there, you need to be ready, whether that's registering your IP abroad or just understanding that sometimes counterfeit goods will pull you into a market that you're not prepared for. But it's just making sure everybody, in the company as much as possible is on the same page and is understanding that. So we have a lot of resources on our website that I can put in the chat as well that can be helpful around that, going through some of those topics and first steps that people can take in that direction.
Awesome. I'll take two more questions here before we move on. The first question, if you could share, what are the dangers of the aforementioned counterfeit masks? Are they made with dangerous poisonous materials, or do they just not provide the appropriate protection to frontline workers? So either of you want to expound on that?
Sure, I'll start that one off. So I can say in specifically the almost 1 million that we seized, those ones just did not provide the protection that they said they would. So again, these were going to the frontest of the front of the line, right? These are the people that definitely need it the most, I would argue. And they would be operating every day thinking that they have protections that they simply do not, because of the fact that they were not there. To touch on that second part of the question, we have encountered a lot of products where when we send them off, there is a health and safety risk to them. So sometimes we'll send off counterfeit perfumes and it'll come back with chemicals that might be toxic to the skin, or a high lead content in counterfeit toys or something like that. So it's a little of both, but as far as the masks themselves, the ones that we seized anyway recently, those ones they just didn't provide any benefit that they said they did.
Right. And you really start looking at where these are coming from and what type of factories and facilities that are manufacturing them. And we saw at the beginning of the pandemic how you had these factories over in Asia, mainly in China, that were pivoting from 1 week to making counterfeit airbags or counterfeit Viagra to all of a sudden now they're making PPE or counterfeit pharma that's somehow going to help stave off the infection of COVID-19. And they don't have any OSHA regulations. They don't have any workplace rules with regard to the purity of their products or what goes into their products, regardless of what that product may be. And you also have to look at who's actually doing this work. And a lot of times these are forced labor. There's labor trafficking involved in these organizations that are manufacturing these products, people working and living in inhumane conditions as they're being forced to produce these goods. So there's victimization all along the line from the poor individuals that are being forced to produce these goods to the end user who's getting something that at best is not going to do what it says it's going to do, but at worst is going to create additional harm and danger to them or to their loved ones.
Great. And the last question we have, and I think that you both touched on this through various the seizures as well as some of the legislative movements. What factors make Michigan particularly vulnerable? Either want to expound on that first? I'll leave it up to the group. It's a loaded question.
So I'm happy to start. and I know Chris has a very different perspective and sees it very differently. So I would say anywhere that has consumers and anywhere that people are doing online shopping makes them particularly vulnerable. There are still some countries in the world that don't yet quite have this problem, but we certainly do here. We also, an international border. We have an international airport. We are open for commerce. So all of these factors, just by themselves, I mean, they may seem very basic, but it really has an impact. I don't know. It's sort of very, very challenging, if yet impossible, to know the number of counterfeit goods that Americans or even Michiganders can consume in a year, or do consume or purchase. Um, but we know. I mean, I think of my own personal experience, and I know it's high for me. So I wonder what it is for people who have no idea that they're buying illicit goods.
Yeah, to second on that, I think that makes a lot of sense. I fully agree with what she said. Any place where there's consumers, you're going to find people buying stuff, trying to get deals. Some know that it's counterfeit, some don't, right? Also, as Mr. Albans pointed out at the beginning, like here in Michigan, we do have our relationship with Canada. He mentioned the statistics on the semi trucks coming in every day and going out from there. I mean, we do have an international border. So due to those two things, it's like the population center, the people looking for things, and then also the border. It all adds up. And to touch on what we talked about in the last question too, is like Mr. Albans is 100% right. Like some of these people they'll pivot so quickly, and they'll change when they see an opportunity. They'll go from making one thing to, during the pandemic, he gave that perfect example that they switched to personal protective equipment, and they'll do it very quickly because they realize the money's there. It kind of touches back on what manufacturers can do. I know it's hard sometimes in big organizations or in government to get the ship to move, but sometimes it's being able to pivot as well, just as fast as the bad guys do. Being able to pivot is what can help us try to fight this fight forward as well.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add is, and really it's why Ed and I are here, and the whole USAIT exists is because, I mean, Chris talks about you have a huge freshwater international border for the entire state of Michigan. And he gave a brief overview at the beginning with regard to the various crimes that HSI is charged with enforcing and investigating and prosecuting. And they probably have 200 special agents or so for the entire state if they're lucky. I don't even think that many probably. So, and they're covering all sorts of things from human trafficking to narcotics trafficking. And it's just a huge challenge to try to do that with one group of global task force officers, right? And so that's why these public-private partnerships are so important, because when you have private industry that's able to direct or help direct those resources to places where they know there's criminal activity occurring, and the agents can get right into it and not have to do a lot of legwork and share that information. Again, Carrie mentioned that these these companies have significant amounts of information that me as a law enforcement officer never knew existed until you actually delved into it and to see what they had. And it was so helpful and so critical to conducting these investigations. You could get, thousands of hours of boots on the ground type investigative work done in days with the data that's contained by some of these companies, and really helpful in making these cases and directing resources to the proper place where they can have the most impact. So listen, I think this has been a fantastic panel. We could probably do another 2 hours just talking about enforcement on our own, but I think that's really great. Carrie and Chris, thanks again so much for joining us, and more importantly, for what you guys do every day in this space. It's essentially critical to the prosperity and well-being in this country. And so really do appreciate it. So thanks again, and look forward to our paths crossing again. And we'll take a little break here, Ed, as we move to the next panel and bring our other groups in. Thanks again, guys. Appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Beth.
All right, as we bring the other groups in, this one's going to be industry executives and experts and we're going to get their perspective on the fight against illegal trade. So we'll let them join in here, and we'll start momentarily. think we're waiting for one more. There we go. Great. So thanks everybody for joining us. What I'll do is we had a really good panel previously. Hopefully you were able to listen with regard to the enforcement challenges. Really want to get the private sector industry perspective on this issue and really get a sense of what is being done to help combat these crimes and these challenges that we're facing as a country from illegal trade. So I will introduce each of you individually, let you go ahead and give a little bit brief about your background and how you're involved in this space. And once we get through the introductions, then we'll move on to the Q&A. And again, those that are listening or participating in the audience, please keep those questions coming. Those were great questions, really helped the flow of the conversation. So thanks for doing that and keep them coming. So we'll start with Paul. Paul Brandstetter is the Director and Assistant General Counsel for Procter & Gamble. Paul, why don't you give us a little bit about yourselves and what you do?
Yeah, hi, good morning. Thank you for having me. Yeah, as mentioned, I'm the North American Director for Brand Protection. I'm an Ohio State guy, so please don't hold that against me here in Michigan. I have been with P&G for about almost 9 or 10 years. I've been in this space for a couple of years. It's primarily a anti-counterfeiting program that, that's the number one issue that we see. Why is it important to us? As mentioned, first and foremost, it's a consumer fraud. It's a potential health and safety issue. So whether it's a Gillette razor, a toothbrush, skin cream, shampoo, when we, sort of as mentioned, when we find manufacturing sites of where this product is produced, it's more often than not in, unsafe, unsanitary circumstances, and so we can't guarantee that it's going to be a healthy and safe product for consumers to use. So it's a really important issue for us. And also, as mentioned, it's connected to we know that it's connected to other crimes, whether it's forced labor, human trafficking, drugs, etc. Globally, we have a team of about maybe 25 to 30 employees who are solely looking at this issue globally. From a North American perspective, not a ton of counterfeit P&G product is produced here in the U.S. Most of it is brought in from overseas. So that really leaves us with sort of two tasks. One, how do we stop it from getting in? And that's primarily from, working with U.S. Customs. And then secondly, how do we shut down and hold responsible those who brought it in? And so that's where working with law enforcement is increasingly more important. Kind of high level trends that we've seen. I'll touch on these, I guess, a bit before we get into questions, but kind of high level trends, obviously, the rise of e-commerce. I think it was Carrie who mentioned it earlier that, it's becoming, and we certainly see this. So I echo her statements. It's becoming, much more rare that we find counterfeit product in, brick and mortar locations. It's all going on e-com just because it's so easy to sell that way. We see small parcel shipments certainly on the rise. So when we investigate back to a seller, they may only have a few boxes on hand with them, but that's simply because they just have a constant flow of cargo coming in relatively small amounts. But it's at such frequency, over time, it certainly adds up. But it's harder to track that way. We've certainly seen a rise in third-party, sort of independent third-party fulfillment centers. So kind of middlemen being used to sort of shield sellers who are located overseas. That's something that we've seen more and more of. And then, finally, we've obviously seen an uptick in the organized retail crime issue that just seems to have just kind of exploded recently. And so that's something kind of that we're dealing with and putting together strategies to handle as well. We have an ongoing test purchase program primarily targeted at e-commerce platforms to look at sort of suspicious listings that is sort of our eyes and ears on the ground to assess what brands are being counterfeited, to what extent they're being counterfeited, and sort of start our investigations from there. So In all these situations, partnering with law enforcement is incredibly important. So thank you so much for having me, and I will pause there.
Thanks, Paul. That was great. Look forward to getting into the questions. Our next panelist is Tara Steketien. Tara, forgive me if I pronounce your name incorrectly. Tara is a director of global product integrity with Merck. So please, floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Matt. I am so pleased to join this panel. Michigan is one of my favorite states. I come from a long line of Michiganders, and you did pronounce my name correctly. And a lot of people in Michigan pretty much are the only ones that can pronounce my last name. So thank you for doing that.
Well, maybe my 2 years I spent there paid off then.
Yeah, maybe. It could be that. We at Merck, we have a program, a global product integrity program that was funded at the direction of our CEO more than 13 years ago. And we've built the program, over those 13 years. It started out with one person, and we have more than 30 folks globally that are dedicated only to product integrity. My role at Merck is to lead. I'm the global director for product integrity, and I focus on counterfeit and diversion investigations, as well as outreach and awareness related to diversion and counterfeit. We're really focused on awareness as a component, and really important component of the investigations that we do. The investigations that we do, we're responsible within our company for all of the reactive complaints that come into our company globally about, someone, a provider or a patient might say, gosh, this product, I've been taking this for years and it's not working anymore. And I may have also purchased it outside of the supply chain. We'll investigate all of those signals that come into the company, but we also are heavily focused on building proactive investigations based on threat profiles that we learn about it and really develop related to counterfeit medicine and to wide scale diverted medicine. But awareness is a very big component of that as well. Because, when we started, we were very, very focused on learning how to build those investigations as best as we could so that we could refer those cases to law enforcement for eventual criminal enforcement. But what we learned after, building some really fabulous relationships with law enforcement, and those are relationships that we continue to focus on, what we learned is that working on those investigations wasn't enough. It's not enough. It's important to also really focus on creating awareness about this issue, both, to patients, to consumers, and also, in general to law enforcement and policymakers. So I'll stop there, except, I've been with Merck for about 10 years, if that's helpful.
Thank you, Tara. That was great. And our last panelist will be Carolina Gonzalez, who's with the Illicit Trade Prevention Analyst for Philip Morris International. Carol?
Thank you, Matt, and thank you for having me. So I'm with Philip Morris International, focusing on our illicit trade prevention efforts in the United States, sometimes supporting our colleagues abroad. In the United States, I spearhead our law enforcement training, so I see a lot of work with capacity training and forensic analysis, as well as supporting any investigations of black market or gray market products that we see. But just a little bit of background, I do want to make a difference that Philip Morris International is not the same company as Philip Morris USA. Philip Morris International is the global company that is selling conventional cigarettes and reduced risk products in around 180 countries around the world. But when it comes to illicit trade prevention, we are, I think at this point, 80 people globally that look at these issues and try to understand the market trends, the way that we can approach law enforcement with data and information sharing and just see what we can do. But most importantly about our company is that around 5 to 10 years ago, we started a massive transformation, moving away from conventional cigarettes to smoke-free products. And we're trying to move 1.1 billion smokers to less harmful alternatives. So that's why I say reduced risk products. I don't know if people have heard of this term before, but our main product is called IQOS, IQOS. It's an electronic device that heats tobacco instead of burning it. Just want to make sure that if I turn from cigarettes to IQOS, that you understand what I'm talking about. But our idea is more that if we want to deliver a smoke-free future, we really need to make sure and we need to ensure that there are no other actors that are sustaining a black market for cigarettes. And that could be of alternatives or that could be of conventional cigarettes. So we are equipped with a group of experts that focuses on this. But the issue itself, which I will go into, is that a lot of people think that it's a misdemeanor or a petty crime. In reality, statistics show that it is a global issue. We are talking about an estimated size of the global illicit economy being around 600 billion cigarettes. So that means that 10 to 12% of all cigarettes smoked worldwide are illicit. And that has a massive tax loss for all countries around the world, around 40 to 50 billion US dollars annually. But if we're talking about the United States, the specifics is that in the United States, we have 21% of all cigarettes consumed being either smuggled or counterfeit, and that is a $7 billion tax loss to the United States. But knowing that I have Michigan as an audience, Michigan has a smuggling rate of almost 19.7%. That means that it is 15th in the state. It is one of the highest smuggling rates that we can see. But the biggest issue comes with the tax loss, which is 195 million in revenue impact, money that should be going to social services, money that should be going to law enforcement, protecting our communities. But in reality, it's just lining the pockets of criminals. And that has to do a lot with the difference in excise tax. Because, for example, Michigan has a state tax of 200 cents per pack. But if you go nearby, you see that Indiana has 99.5 cents per pack, Ohio has 160 cents per pack, and Iowa has 136. So even really between the states that border Michigan, you can see a slight profit by buying cigarettes in another state and selling it yours. We see more disparity between states like, let's say, Indiana and states like New York. There's a lot of profit there. And there are a lot of case studies that I will sort of plug into the chat so that we can go into the questions. But there is a very famous case called Operation Smokescreen that basically was a Hezbollah cell that was engaged in cigarette smuggling between North Carolina and Michigan between 1995 and the year 2000. So meaning that in North Carolina, you could buy cigarettes with a state tax of 5 cents. But in Michigan, it was 75 cents. So there was a lot of profit there. And they did that for around 5 years, sending all of their profits to Hezbollah in Lebanon. So that's one of the examples of the nexus and the ties that we see and the reason that we're so committed to solving this issue. But I'll stop there and we can jump to questions, Matt. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carol. Great. That's really good background, and you know, really like to salute PMI for really being one of the driving companies behind this USAIT initiative and really working in this space, and not just on tobacco issues, but on everything that's involved in it because of the links to other more nefarious crimes and criminal organizations, both domestically and internationally. So, Paul, one of the things you mentioned I'd like to try to talk about a little bit more, not only because, but in particular because it's gotten so much more notoriety. And we're seeing these smash and grabs on the TV on the nightly news all the time. And while organized retail crime isn't new, it's certainly becoming much more prevalent in the mainstream society and the media. It's being seen, and people are witnessing it themselves or experiencing the impacts of it. Maybe can you talk a little bit more about what P&G has done for that? And do you guys have any solutions or initiatives or maybe some legislative changes that you would be looking at that would be helpful in this space?
Yeah, yeah, it's a good question. I think, yeah, it's an important issue. We know it's on the rise. We know it's connected to other crimes. For us, we obviously value our retailer partnerships because, the products are not necessarily, they're not stolen from P&G. They're stolen from, big box stores, our retailers, people that we partner with on a day-to-day basis. And so it's important for us to help them as much as we can in a variety of ways. So, a number of things that we've begun to do is, when we, like I said, we have a very extensive ongoing sort of test purchase program. A lot of times we'll buy something, that looks sort of suspicious online. It might have, not always, but it might have, some sort of store notification tag still on it that was not removed either. Sometimes you can still see a bit of residue or it's just still there completely. And so what we've done is sort of, I would say over the last, year or two is try to build partnerships with, our retailers, because they all have investigative groups, right? They have teams that are looking at this. And so when we have a lead on, hey, we have the seller selling this product, we think it came from your store. How can we best partner on this? Because more often than not, they're going to have, better data overall than we will, or we might find that a certain seller has already been on their radar and they're already working with law enforcement on an investigation. So I would say it's partnering with them in that way. We also can look back, not to get into too much detail, but or overwhelmed with too much detail, but we can basically look at the product and figure out what the sort of sales distribution was for that particular product, which can be really helpful in many occasions of, if we're trying to trace back to a particular retailer, that information can be helpful. And then we also have a team that is sort of working from an in-store angle. How can we make these more difficult to steal while still making it somewhat, a somewhat enjoyable experience for the consumer. If you lock things up too much, then that sort of, we get complaints about that. But at the same time, we, things that are, high level targets, how do we make those a bit more difficult to steal at the same time? So sort of attacking it from both ends.
Yeah, no, that's great. And we've seen recently, in looking at this, there's a lot of organizations that are starting to utilize these stolen goods, just general things that you wouldn't think of as being commodities for, trade-based money laundering schemes, where they're smuggling these things south into Mexico and basically using them as currency, because then they're being turned around and sold there. And one of the challenges, it's not just, in this area, when you start talking about illicit trade and some of the things, whether it's cigarette smuggling or organized retail crime, like the penalties just aren't there. And, trying to get law enforcement, U.S. attorneys' offices or state district attorneys' offices have limited resources, and trying to get those entities to be willing to put those resources towards working some of these cases, which are a bit laborious at times and sometimes don't have the sexiness to them, does become a challenge. So it really is, and I speak from a law enforcement perspective, that's where I spent my career, but seeing the investment that industry is making across the board in trying to find ways to, one, stop the criminal activity to begin with, but two, partner with law enforcement and provide good information to the consumer, to me is great. I mean, I think it's a holistic approach that really does start to move the needle in a direction that's a positive one. So thanks, Paul, for what all you guys do over there. Tara, following up on one of the things you mentioned with regard to information sharing, and you mentioned the relationships that you built with law enforcement. That's one of the questions we get a lot from industry, and especially some of the smaller companies. How do they build these relationships? How do you get these points of contact and start to know these entities so that you can reach out to them directly when something occurs, or share your information? And again, that was one of the questions or issues that was raised in the prior panel. But I think it'd be worth addressing, as well as, again, as the concerns with regard to the proprietary information that companies have, and not wanting to give that up in a way that could potentially impact their business. From a law enforcement perspective, we were the same way, right? We always feel like, we don't trust anybody outside of law enforcement, and we want to keep everything close to the vest, when ultimately, without that information sharing, those channels and the trust between private and public, you're not going to be nearly as effective as possible. So maybe if you could speak to that a little bit, please.
Sure. I think the key is, for industry folks to really focus on training and outreach. And yes, it can be hard to know how to go about that, especially, for someone that's at a smaller company. Leveraging resources that are available to industry, like the IPR Center, or participating in trade associations like USAIT or, INTA, working, participating in ACAP, allows industry folks to interact with other people that are in the same space, and just, find out who the good law enforcement contacts are, and how to reach out. I think in our program, and we built our program, over time, and we did it slowly, especially in the beginning. One of the things that we focused on in the very beginning was ensuring that our team was comprised of folks that have various backgrounds. I'm one of the few people in our product integrity group, especially, on the team that handles investigations. I'm one of the few people that has no law enforcement background. Most of the folks on our team have either federal or local law enforcement background. And we also, because our product integrity team is matrixed within a larger global security group, which is mostly staffed by, especially in the US, former US federal law enforcement, we took our time in the very beginning to learn a lot about building a case effectively, and to understand that when we do build a case effectively, that's not just sending a bunch of websites out to law enforcement and saying, can you handle this? It's really, conducting undercover test purchases, documenting everything with chain of custody, and, pulling information and intelligence together that helps law enforcement understand the breadth of these, organized crime groups that are trafficking and counterfeit, but also allows, it facilitates, law enforcement building their own case based on the information that we're providing. So we took our time with that, and we wanted to do it thoughtfully. And when we do refer cases, we don't expect information back. There's always, there's information exchange, certainly, and, we're happy to provide access to all of our resources. We have a forensic lab, and we'll provide, forensic testing of any of the products that are collected as, either by law enforcement or by us, part of those proactive investigations. But providing all of those resources to law enforcement and letting them know that we're available to testify, and we will absolutely testify at the last minute, so that the case can be very, very successful. Reaching out to law enforcement and letting them know that, and letting them know what resources we have, and just being available. That's, for us, I think that's what helped us build successful relationships in general, and it helps us. And law enforcement likes to get good cases, right? And prosecutors like to win cases, so focus on that when we're gathering all of the evidence for our cases. But I think creating that awareness happens the good old-fashioned way. It's about picking the phone up, checking in to see how a case is going, and if there's anything that we can do to support, or meeting folks that are interested in working these cases, maintaining those relationships and continuously offering support. That's what's for us.
No, that's great. I mean, and I go back to the days when I was an agent on the street, working various types of cases, and I saw, the U.S. Attorney's Office is actually where, obviously where we prosecute cases federally. You could walk in there with 2 cases with similar fact patterns, me and another agent, and whichever case is put together properly and has all the information, and it's basically a turnkey case for that U.S. attorney that can walk into the court and prosecute that case and get a plea on an easy basis because they're not even have to work because it's been put together so well, it's been written and documented. That makes such a huge difference because the U.S. attorney's offices are limited staffed as well, and every law enforcement agency is going to tell you that they need resources, and it's true. So the more that industry can do to have a model like that, which I think is, Tara, is one that probably should be replicated throughout, and I'm sure many big companies do that. I know they do, and it really is effective. And from a law enforcement perspective, when you've got multiple reports coming in or leads coming in, when you know that you're getting one from a trusted partner that you've worked with before that puts together a product that is airtight, that you can walk into any U.S. attorney's office and drop on their desk and they'll be like, yeah, we'll take this case. That's a huge win for everybody. And one thing you did mention, which hasn't come up, which surprisingly has yet to come up this far in the conversation, and we use the acronym. So just the IPRC, the Intellectual Property Rights Coordination Center, that is run. It's an entity that across the federal government. It's actually led by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, but there's more than 30 law enforcement and private sector and academia entities that are part of that, and they all sit in a congregate setting, working cases jointly together. And for those of you that are in the audience that aren't familiar with that, go to the ICE website. You can go to ice.gov and you can find the IPRC there. There's a ton of resources for you there, and there's ways to get in touch with individuals that can help you. So if you're just looking to get started or looking to get some information or some assistance, the IPRC is a huge resource. That's what they're there for. They get funded specifically by Congress. They're on a line item to do the type of work that they're doing, and they really do a great job. See many task forces in my career, some good, some bad. This is at the top as far as ones that are actually productive on the back end because people really are committed to the mission, regardless of where they're coming from or what their backgrounds are in that area. So, Tara, thank you for that. Appreciate that. Caro, you mentioned the illicit cigarette trade and how it impact with terrorism and some of the other challenges that we face with regard to its convergence with other criminal activity. And obviously you mentioned, the impact in the cigarette area, but PMI has made significant investments in this space in particular. And why is that? I mean, why do you feel like PMI has been that towards the forefront of putting in a significant investment into this area to combat illicit trade, no matter the shape it takes?
So yeah, I think of course it started with our own products being smuggled, counterfeited. There's also a term called illicit whites, which are basically cigarettes that are manufactured to be illegally introduced to different markets. So for example, you see cigarettes being manufactured in Asia, but they have, they're not counterfeiting on the brand. They're basically creating their own brand, but they know they're gonna ship it to Latin America. So their branding is in Spanish, and it's like El Chapo, El Naco. It's like very alluring to people that live in those areas. And so we see that there is a lot of people that are very engaged in this activity, mainly because it is a very high profit, low risk activity, meaning that you could move one container of illicit cigarettes into a market like the United States and earn from $2 to $3 million, depending on the brands you're counterfeiting. It's a lot of money, and the penalties are not that high. So if it were a container full of drugs, if it were a container full of something else, you wouldn't be able to do it again. So it's an activity that allows terrorist groups and criminal organizations to keep funding their other activities because it's easy to do, and if they get caught, they can still do it again. And so that's where it sort of started, from our own product, but then understanding that we are not the only industry going through this issue alone. So right now we have consumer goods and pharmaceutical in the same space, having to go through the same issues. But I think as a company, it's just decided that the way that we have to work is working together. We as an industry cannot do it alone, not even private sector. That's why we reached out to law enforcement so much to do trainings on forensic analysis and to the government to see if they have any policies to make it easier for us to go after these criminal actors. But I think mainly is that's the reason. And as we move towards smoke-free future, trying to move away completely from conventional cigarettes, if PMI stops doing that, that doesn't mean everyone's going to stop. So we have to make sure that the criminal actors that are going to continue to supply the markets with cigarettes are prosecuted, because they produce cigarettes in unregulated conditions. They allow access to minors because they're just profit-based. And then there are a lot of consequences for that. You see a lot of corruption with people smuggling cigarettes in and out of free trade zones, and so it just creates a weakened rule of law. And that's something that we cannot turn our back to, even as we turn to different products. I will say, though, that it is a lot of different commodities that we see. Some of them you can imagine, like cigarettes, you could understand. But once I started working in the sphere, I understand that these criminal actors go for everything. I've seen counterfeit medicine, so medicine for your pets. I've seen things that you use to work out. So honestly, it also is on our end to inform consumers and the wider public of all the different counterfeits that you can find, and make sure that we as consumers understand what is out there, what are the consequences, what are the groups that we're funding. And so that's basically where we started from.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that people don't realize is that the same transnational criminal organizations that are involved in narcotics trafficking or humans trafficking or weapons smuggling are also utilizing cigarette smuggling and other forms of illicit trade to help fund those other criminal activities. This is a revenue stream for them. And a lot of times what you'll see is, especially when you start looking at smuggling routes, right? They'll use a product or a commodity that is one that's not going to raise a ton of eyebrows or potentially not lead to any significant loss of funds or potential criminal prosecution exposure, to do some penetration testing, whether it's to try a route, a new route of smuggling, whether it's domestically or internationally. So then they'll use that a couple times, because if their 18-wheeler of cigarettes gets popped by a state highway patrol, it's not a huge loss, and it's some lower level member of their organization that goes to jail for a short period of time, as opposed to if that was, the next 2 loads that we're going to run were going to be full of narcotics or full of people, where you're going to have much more significant consequences from a criminal perspective for those individuals. So the money that gets from these things, and again, it's not just illicit cigarettes, the money that comes from counterfeit pharmaceuticals or from consumer goods that are counterfeited or stolen through organized retail crime and go back to these criminal organizations. These are not petty, low-level criminals on the street that are committing these crimes. They may be the ones that are actually boots on the ground, going into the CVS and the Targets and ripping large numbers of goods out or selling things on the internet. But ultimately, there's a criminal organization, probably international, behind all of these actors that is making significant sums of money from it, that are usually using it to fund more nefarious activities. Again, whether it's terrorism, narcotics trafficking, weapons, human beings. And so they're all interrelated. And going after one helps close down the avenues for the others as well. So,
Matt, an example. Just 2 months ago, with the help of LASD, we seized a container coming into the port of LA. We were looking for cigarettes, and we found some luxury goods from, sorry, I'm hearing an echo, but from Dior, Chanel, all these luxury good items. And that's something where there's always an overlap. And that's when we turn to other industry partners to let them know that their products have been counterfeited. What should we do? And then they can also work out with LASD to see how to destroy these products, what to do, where they came from. And so it's also that once we're looking for our own products, we always see an overlap with others, and that's why we continue to work with other industries as well.
Great, thank you. Ed, do we have any questions coming in from the audience yet? I don't think I see anything coming up. All right, that's okay. I got plenty of questions. So, Paul, I mean, one of the things that came up on the prior panel was how can a consumer prevent or fortify themselves against buying illicit goods. I'm just curious what, from a corporate perspective, that you guys are doing with regard to raising awareness of this issue to the consumers, both for Paul and Tara, with regard to, are you guys doing concerted media campaigns or doing any sort of educational efforts to ensure that consumers know, the right way to buy their products and get what they're actually spending their money for, especially now with, funds being short and things costing more than they did previously. People are looking to make sure that, well, one, they want to make sure that what they're buying is real, so they're actually getting the return on their investment. But two, there's limited dollars, and if they're going to spend them, they want to make sure they spend them in a way that's effective and not something that puts themselves or their family at risk.
Yeah. So yeah, I would say a couple of things. First, we probably do most of our outreach through groups like USA IT to help kind of spread the message. And then I would say, with regard to sort of, if you're a consumer and you're worried about it, our recommendation would always be, make a purchase from a trusted retailer, whether that's, actually in person at, brick and mortar retailer, or if you're going to buy online, buy direct. If there's a third party seller with a price that's maybe too good to be true, it might just be that, right? It might just be too good to be true. So our recommendation is to always sort of buy it from the most trusted source possible.
Tara, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what Paul was saying. I think the pandemic changed things in so many ways, right? And one of the biggest ways is that, especially in the very beginning when folks could not leave the house or were discouraged from leaving the house, we saw an entirely new patient population and consumer population making purchases online out of necessity. And so that was transformational certainly for us in the anti-counterfeiting space, I'd say across the board. But even we were seeing patients that would never have, thought of purchasing something online, having to move to online. So yes, I think one of the things that we're really cognizant about now is creating awareness about the right places to buy medicine through regulated supply chain channels. And there are regulated supply chain channels online in the US. There are authorized online pharmacies that are certified and inspected and things like that. And those are safe ways to get medication. So we do work on awareness campaigns, and we're actually working on a national campaign right now, but we do it in partnership with trade associations and with public health associations, because what we found in our industry is that the messaging coming from us about counterfeit medicine, we're not the best voice for that medicine for patients. Patients want to hear from providers, and they want to hear from folks that represent that public health arena in a way, the messaging wouldn't resonate as much necessarily as if it was coming from us. So we will partner with associations in that manner, but USAIT did a phenomenal awareness campaign last year that moved into this year as well. And that was a really great way for us to get information for us as a company and for all of the participants to get information out about illicit trade and the dangers. So those are the kinds of things that we focus on. But just, because we're all here on this panel to create some awareness, maybe just please everyone just keep in mind that Facebook is not where we want to buy medicine, or we don't want to buy it through WhatsApp or through Snapchat. I used to think that would go without saying, but I think with the move to just really so many purchases online, folks get confused. But really, I'd encourage everyone to purchase their medicines from the places that you recognize if you're purchasing online, or look in to where you're purchasing from, and take your time, like Carrie Campbell said, and be thoughtful about where you're sourcing.
No, that's a great message, Tara. Thank you. Kyra, anything you want to add?
I mean, going off from Tara said, I will say that the people here, we are a great resource to law enforcement, and I know everyone here we buy things online, we buy things in brick and mortar. We are here if you ever have any questions, if you ever have any cases that have to do with illicit trade in tobacco products. Even if you don't know, just ask us. We're always happy to help. I will plug in my email information in the chat. If any time you have any questions, it could be also that because us as an industry in the brand protection world, we know each other. It could be that we could give you the right contact. The ACUP Center and the IPR Center are also great places to go to. And the USAIT website, which I know is already plugged there, we are all connected through that network, so you can use it as a one-stop shop. And that case or whatever issue you're having in your state, any questions you might have on who to reach out to, it'll get to the right person. So we're always here to help.
Great. Ed?
Sorry about that. Well, first, thank you, Matt, and thank you to all of our panelists today for sharing your critical insight and your experiences on such an important issue in Michigan, in our country, and frankly around the world. So just to conclude, we hope you enjoyed our training today and encourage you to share the information you've learned with other public and private allies and concerned citizens who have expressed alarm over the rise of this threat, both in Michigan and our greater society. For more information on how illegal trade impacts Michigan and our nation as a whole, and for resources on reporting illegal trade-related crimes, please visit our website at usait.org. And with that, we will conclude today's event. Thank you all again for joining today, and look forward to staying in touch with you all. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate your time.